He stayed strong. He didn't give up. He kept going, even when things were very hard. Pastor Charles Stanley, a man known for preaching about family and faith for 50 years, was going through private struggles that few people knew about. On the outside, he looked like a strong and faithful leader. But inside his home, things were falling apart. His wife asked for a divorce. His son left the church. His daughter quietly watched as everything collapsed around them. After Charles Stanley passed away in 2023, his family finally spoke up about his final days, and what they shared surprised many people. The man who stood in the church, speaking powerful words every week, was not the same man his family knew at home. In fact, the last 3 words he ever spoke to his son changed everything between them. Charles Stanley was born on September 25, 1932, in a small town called Dry Fork, Virginia. It was during the Great Depression, a time when millions of people were jobless and struggling to survive. His parents, Charlie Stanley and Rebecca Hall, were barely making it. People were losing their homes, standing in long lines for food, and trying to keep their families together. It was one of the hardest times in American history to raise a child. But even through that tough beginning, Charles Stanley would grow into one of the most powerful and well-known voices in Christian ministry. Just 9 months after he was born, tragedy struck. His father suddenly died at the age of 29. One day he was there, the next day he was gone. No chance to say goodbye. No memories left behind. Only a name and silence. His mother, Rebecca, was left to raise her baby alone during one of the hardest economic times ever. That feeling of loss stayed with Charles for the rest of his life. He often talked about feeling like something was missing, a deep emptiness from never knowing his father. He would wonder who his dad was and what kind of man he might have become with a father to guide him. That longing for a father's love and support later shaped the way Charles spoke about God. To him, God became the perfect father, the one who never leaves, never forgets, and never gives up on you. When Charles was 9 years old, his mother got remarried. She believed she was doing what was best, trying to give her son the father figure he had lost. But that decision ended up bringing even more pain. Her new husband, John Hall, turned out to be an alcoholic with a violent temper. The problems began almost immediately after the wedding. Within 2 weeks, Rebecca knew she had made a terrible mistake. John's own family had tricked her. They knew he was abusive but told her he would change after marriage. He didn't. Charles grew up in fear. He saw his stepfather choke his mother. He would lock his bedroom door every night and sometimes even kept a loaded gun near his bed because he felt so unsafe. He was just a child, but he felt like he was living in a battlefield. That fear and trauma didn't just hurt him, it shaped him. It taught him that survival takes deep faith and that God is the only one you can always trust. In the middle of all this chaos, Charles found peace in the church. His family was Pentecostal, and his grandfather, George Washington Stanley, had helped start the Emmanuel Pentecostal Holiness Church in their town. His parents were active in the church, and Charles grew up surrounded by passionate sermons, emotional prayers, and powerful worship. When things got too bad at home, he would escape to the church basement. There he would pray out loud, sometimes crying, sometimes shouting, begging God for peace. He didn't just whisper prayers, he poured his whole heart into them. Even though he would later become a Baptist, that emotional, fiery style of worship from his Pentecostal roots stayed with him. It influenced how he preached, how he led, and how he connected with people. When Charles was 17, he went to visit his grandfather in Siler City, North Carolina. At that time, he wasn't sure if he was ready to become a preacher. He felt too young, too hurt, too unsure of himself. But his grandfather gave him one sentence that changed his life. He said, "Charles, if God tells you to put your head through a brick wall, you run at it. It's his job to make the hole." That message hit him deeply. From that moment on, Charles lived by one rule: obey God and leave the consequences to him. It wasn't just a nice saying, it was how he survived. When life gave no clear answers, his faith gave him strength. That belief became his foundation. In the 1950s, Charles began studying formally. He attended the University of Richmond and later Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. This was a time when Bible schools were growing fast. Since 1945, the number of students enrolling in Christian colleges had tripled. Christianity was changing too, moving from small churches into new places like radio and television. Billy Graham had just started his famous crusades in 1949, and evangelism was becoming a national movement. Charles jumped into this new world with energy. He studied Greek, Hebrew, theology, and preaching. But he wasn't just learning the words of the Bible. He was learning how to make them real for people, how to speak to their pain and struggles. By 1957, he was only 25 years old, but he was already serving as a pastor and teaching at Fruitland Baptist Church in North Carolina. It was a small church with about 150 members in a quiet mountain town, but it was exactly what he needed. He also taught classes at the nearby Bible Institute. His weekly pay was only $75, but he didn't mind. He loved what he was doing. He was learning how to lead, how to preach, and how to connect with people who were hurting. Many of the people in his church were farmers or factory workers dealing with poverty and uncertainty. Charles gave them more than sermons. He gave them comfort, hope, and someone who truly cared. In 1958, at the age of 26, Charles Stanley was officially ordained as a Baptist minister. That was just the beginning of a journey that would touch millions of lives, but also come with private pain that many didn't see until long after he was gone. Christian audiences and leaders were divided. Many were sympathetic to Charles Stanley, pointing to the strain of leading a global ministry. Others saw the disintegration of his marriage as hypocrisy. Either way, the divorce wasn't just personal. It was a public crisis. The fallout. When the divorce was finalized in 2000, it marked a rare and painful moment in evangelical leadership. Charles Stanley made it clear he wouldn't step down unless he remarried, as he believed divorce alone didn't disqualify him from preaching. First Baptist Atlanta stood by him. So did In Touch Ministries. But the fracture with his son Andy was deep and real. Andy Stanley, now the founder and lead pastor of North Point Community Church, had already begun stepping away from his father's shadow. But the split grew wider in the 2000s. They had different visions of church, different preaching styles, and fundamentally different philosophies on leadership and culture. Charles was traditional, expository, deeply conservative. Andy was modern, pragmatic, seeker-sensitive. In interviews, Andy hinted at wounds left unhealed. He spoke of respecting his father but not always agreeing with him. The once close father and son became two different towers in American Christianity, rarely overlapping, rarely speaking publicly about each other. The final days. Charles Stanley officially stepped down as senior pastor of First Baptist Atlanta in September 2020, after 50 years in leadership. He didn't retire completely. He remained pastor emeritus and continued broadcasting sermons, but he knew the end was near. He spent his final years away from the spotlight. Friends say he was still full of passion but increasingly reflective, often talking about legacy, forgiveness, and the unfixable things in life. The man who once faced down church fights, cultural critics, and personal heartbreaks had mellowed. He began to focus more on prayer, writing, and select correspondence. In April 2023, at age 90, Charles Stanley passed away quietly in his sleep. There was no media blitz, no dramatic hospital scenes. Just a quiet moment, his family says, with the Bible open near his bedside. But the final twist came after his death. The last words. 4 years, Andy Stanley kept silent about their rocky relationship. But at his father's funeral, he broke that silence. Andy revealed that in one of their final conversations, Charles looked at him and simply said, "I'm proud of you." Those 3 words, spoken after decades of distance, broke something open. They were not an apology, not an explanation, but they were enough. Andy said that moment healed something between them. It didn't erase the past, but it gave them peace. A small redemption at the end of a complicated journey. Legacy and truth. Charles Stanley leaves behind one of the most influential ministries in modern Christianity. Over 2,500 sermons, a media empire, a global audience, and a complicated family story that, like so many, was marked by both greatness and grief. He endured. He held up. He was able to hang in there. He didn't faint. But behind the camera, behind the pulpit, he was a man, flawed, hurting, and human. And in the end, it was not the size of his church or the reach of his broadcast that defined him. It was the faith that carried him through every storm, even the ones in his own home.